I'm Gautam Mukunda. Tonight on Greater Boston, Jewish and Muslim college students feel scared to speak their minds as the war in Gaza reaches its 6-month mark. I'll speak with the author of a report that shows just how bad the issue is. Then, a look at the career and impact of Boston's trailblazing journalist Sarah Ann Shaw. And a new exhibit brings the horrors of the Holocaust to life here in Boston. We'll take a look at the new exhibit, Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away. It's been nearly 6 months since Hamas attacked Israel, killing 1,200 people and kidnapping dozens more. Since then, Israeli forces have killed tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, with the millions left behind displaced and cut off from food, water, and medical care. All of it has exacerbated tensions around the world, including on American college campuses. According to a new report from the University of Chicago, more than half of Jewish and Muslim students fear for their safety. GBH News higher education reporter and managing editor Kirk Carapezza spoke with several students in and around Boston. He joins me now, along with the author of the report, University of Chicago political science professor Robert Pape. Kirk, what did the students you were talking to tell you?
They're afraid. They're frightened. They're hearing chants like "from the river to the sea," Palestine will be freed. They're seeing acts of violence. They're not talking to each other. They're protesting, but they're kind of passing each other in the night. And I think what several told me is that we have a generation here that it's easy to forget that, these students were in middle and high school during the pandemic, right? And so for many of them, they're still emerging adults, right? They're not necessarily used to looking each other in the eye, having these difficult conversations about these really hot-button issues. But the Jewish students, some of them are concealing their identity. There's a survey out from a researcher at Tufts that finds a quarter of Jewish students say they need to hide their Jewish identity. That's double what it was in 2022. These students are, talking to each other, but they're not talking across differences. The Palestinian students that I spoke with, these activists are saying that they're being criminalized, they're being called terrorists. And they feel like they're being, while they're outspoken, they feel like their views are being mischaracterized.
Bob, what did your report tell us about how widespread these fears are?
Well, they're more intense and more widespread than we previously knew. We've conducted the first nationally representative survey of college students on this issue since October 7, and we specifically asked questions about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, but also about how do they feel, and particularly, do they feel in personal danger because of their beliefs related to the Israel-Palestine conflict that has flared up on October 7th and since. And what we discovered, as your intro showed, is that 56% of Jewish students feel in personal danger, 52% of Muslim students, and 16% of students who are not Jewish and not Muslim also feel in personal danger. And that last number, 16%, may seem small, but that represents over 2 million college students of the 16 million today. So that's really this is really quite a widespread phenomenon. And as you just heard, independent of us, journalists have been now interviewing students, and they're finding just what we found in our report, because we didn't just ask students to check the box. We asked them if they felt in danger to say why. Give us a few sentences explaining why. And over 87% of the students who said they felt in personal danger explained it. And just as you heard, they're hearing these phrases, and the protesters may think they're peaceful phrases, but they're being interpreted as calls for genocide. And they're seeing acts of violence and acts of intimidation against students on campus. And this is simply scaring large swaths of the student body.
So it's, Kirk, I think one of the more striking parts of the story is we tried to get the students here on television, and they'd all refuse to come.
Right, and as a reporter, I spent weeks building up the trust to get them just to go on the record and so that we could use their names, right? And some of these students have been doxxed, right? We featured a young Egyptian-American student who's Muslim, whose face was on the doxing truck at Harvard, and she expressed kind of the lack of trust she has in the institution. Several of the Jewish students, didn't necessarily want to go on record at first. But yeah, I mean, part of the story I think is that they're not here tonight, right? They're not willing to go on live television and talk about this. There's a lot of fear, and I think a lot of this predates this conflict too. There's a survey out from the Knight Foundation that found in 2019 that found 2/3 of college students say that their campus climate precluded them from expressing their true opinions because they feared that it might offend their classmates. And I think what we're finding is, one professor told me we have these monocultures on campus, whether it's the whole campus or it's certain departments, and it's become antithetical to the whole mission of higher education, right? Which is to have these very difficult conversations and to practice and teach critical inquiry. And that's on some of these campuses, that's not happening.
Bob, is this a story about sort of people actually encountering anti-Semitism or Islamophobia in person, even violent one? Is this a social media story where incidents that are relatively rare get passed around to a remarkable extent? I can tell you personally, I hear about people asking me stories all the time and saying to confirm, so did this actually happen? What does it mean? And it's sort of what I get, that seems to go a lot through WhatsApp groups, so I observed that myself from Jewish and Muslim friends. Some combination between, something has changed both in not just about the war, but sort of the willingness of people to express sentiments of Islamophobia or anti-Semitism in ways that probably would have been very surprising a generation ago.
Yeah, so some of this is about a rising context of anti-Semitism. So we also had a benefit. I did a study of anti-Semitism and support for political violence among American adults, 8,000 in the survey in the spring of 2023. So we were really able to look apples to apples to see the wider context in which the events of October 7 are unfolding and how they're being interpreted. And we can really say in the report that violent anti-Semitism, the tolerance of violent attacks against Jews is increased by 13% among all American adults after October 7, and you're seeing some of the manifestations of that. However, there's a second point that we really discovered in this that we sort of knew it might be there because I've been studying political violence for 30 years. But what we discovered that was a big finding is there's a tragic misunderstanding at the heart of some of the campus fears. You see, we asked questions about from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, this famous pro-Palestinian chant. And what we wanted to know is when you hear that chant, what do you think it means? And we discovered that fully 26% of college students, that's 4 million of the 16 million, think that chant means genocide of the Jews. That's a really big number, and that means they're hearing that as a call for genocide. Well, 66% of Jewish students are hearing that chant and thinking it's a call for genocide of the Jews, and about 2/3 of them are afraid as a result of that. Muslim students, though, it's only 14%. So what does that mean? It means there really are likely some genuine protesters using that chant that means something peaceful by it. But perception can become reality. Hearing that, understanding it as a call for genocide produces fear, even if that's unintended by the people making that chant. So what does this mean? This means there's a tragic misunderstanding, and this is something we can do something about, and do something about now by simply publicizing this information, letting people know that there's this misunderstanding, these different perceptions of the meaning of this phrase. One, a call for genocide, another, very peaceful outcome. What this means is student protesters can maybe think about a different chant, or they can follow that chant with something very quickly that means they don't mean harm to Jews or harm to anybody. And that also means we can do something to calm down these fears that don't require people changing their fundamental positions on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, or don't require the end of legitimate protest. It means that there's something that we can do that won't solve or calm all the fears, but we can start a process of calming fears. And if we can calm some fears, we may discover that will cascade and it will produce a general calming effect.
Well, I think we could keep talking about this forever, but I'm really glad that we could get some real empirical data on what's happening and maybe have a way to take these tensions down that we're learning from this conversation. So Kurt Carapezza, Robert Pape, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Community leaders, politicians, and friends and family gathered in Boston yesterday to honor the city's first black female TV reporter, Dr. Sarah Ann Shaw, who died Thursday at 90 years old.
I wouldn't be where I am today if Miss Shaw had not made time for me. She took me under her wing. And I know I am one of generations who are where they are today because of the example that she set.
In 1968, Shaw became part of the team behind GBH's Say Brother, now known as Basic Black. She went on to a 3 decades-long career at WBZ-TV, which started at the height of the civil rights movement and Boston's busing crisis. In that time, she became known for her compassionate storytelling and her efforts to blaze a trail for the next generation of journalists. Former GBH Vice President of Programming Marita Rivero worked with Shaw for years on Say Brother. And the new publisher of the Bay State Banner, Ron Mitchell, worked with Shaw for much of her time at WBZ-TV. Ron, tell us a little bit about Shaw.
Well, Sarah Ann Shaw was an icon, but a quiet, gentle giant, I will say. Her demeanor was always calm and direct, but she had a tenor underneath that of strength, and she would go and talk truth to power. Many executives and news executives in the newsrooms at that time were really trying to search for ratings. And it was an easy, low lift in the news business to go to that community to talk about the crime or whatever, negative images. If it bleeds, it leads was the tempo back then. But Sarah wasn't having it. She would go and tell the news directors, no, there's other stories here. You have to tell the positive, you have to tell the truth about our community. And she held them accountable and really forged the way for many of us in the industry.
And Marita, when you think of Dr. Shaw, what's your first memory that springs to mind?
I think she's fun. She was easy to approach. People did approach her. She responded to them. She was part of the community. I loved it that she taught kind of all of us that you need to be part of the community, part of the larger community, not just be your job. So she was out in the street. She was available. She had a lot of stories because she knew the people.
And so she had a real legacy on coverage here. So when she spoke about, we have some tape of her speaking about Basic Black's coverage of stories versus other news stations and her hopes about them.
The fact that there's so many things that have repeated and have repeated and repeated. And I want to live long enough to see us to be able to do things that have more staying power. I'd like to know how those like me with this gray hair, how can we communicate to a younger group some of the things we did so they can avoid some of the mistakes and do some other kinds of things that produce some activities that make you say, wow, yeah.
So when she set out to do that, how far do you think she went to achieve that goal?
Oh, my goodness. She was a long-term member of the League of Women for Community Service, which was founded in 1918 in Boston. And over the years, more younger people started coming through that. And she hung in there. She kept saying, wait a minute, where are they? Let's keep bringing them in. She worked with the Boston area, it was the Boston Association of Black Journalists, which we founded before the National Association, which put her in touch with people younger than she was, but coming along, it created a structure in which she could really talk to people. And in later years, she just said, Marita, I've got to get out there. She was very concerned about how she could reach people. Of course, she had people in her own family who were younger. And I think she underestimated, really, how many young people she was able to meet because she was available to them. She wasn't always telling people, this is what you need to do, this is what's wrong with what you're doing, this is how we did it. She really approached people from the point of view that we could all have a conversation. I want to learn from you. And I want to bring more of myself to you than just, I was at this, I was at that, I was the other. I think she was very successful at that.
And If there's any one or handful of lessons that you take from her career for people in the business now, what would they be?
Well, she was a great listener. She was like your mom. For me, she was one person who would sit and she would listen to you.
My mom would be thrilled to hear that she's a great listener.
She would listen to you, she would take the time. And I think the best reporters did that. They respected everybody they talked to, and you could feel that in how they communicated with you, but they would also intelligently guide you, and say, well, you might want to look at it this way, or you might, and keep in mind, and then normally by the end of the conversation, if there was something that she wanted you to learn, you would be like, oh, wow, okay, because the way she approached you was such a loving way and such a respectful way. And I think that that's what made her so successful in getting great stories told, and why she was so persuasive, and how she taught not just video journalists like myself, but other journalists she worked with and other producers in the business, because TV definitely started as being reporter driven, but by the time the 2000s happened and even the 90s when she was really in her heyday, it was a lot more producer driven. But again, she went and she didn't allow them to guide the news when it came to her stories. They were her stories. They were stories about real people, real things that mattered. And she made sure they understood that. And it wasn't going to be boiled down to the most dramatic angle to get ratings. It was the truth. It mattered. This was her community. She was of the community. And she was going to make sure that everybody felt that, understood that. And her love came through in her journalism. It was just, she was a remarkable woman.
When she looked back at her career, do you think there was a particular story that she would highlight as sort of, this was my favorite, as like a moment?
I don't know about the story. I just like to think of her courage in approaching whatever story it was, which lets you come back and say, I could do that. I could take that on. I didn't work with her every day. I remember her from Say Brother, the early days when she was with Henry Hampton and Eyes on the Prize, Henry Hampton, and Stan Lathan, who now works with Chris Rock, and really a stellar group, and she was a host. She just stepped into that job out of being a community activist, and, someone said, we think you could be a part-time host, and she took that on. So I think her courage demonstrated itself in many ways. Her core allowed her to speak back. It allowed her to champion issues other people thought weren't really worth our time. And it allowed her to take on issues and work that it might have been easier to just let go. So as a model for those of us coming along, she was brilliant. She was brilliant. And I appreciate that about her.
Yeah, and I think the thing that people need to understand the most about when she became a reporter, society was going through the serious civil rights movement of our century, of the last century, and as a young black man growing up, I was under scrutiny. And the whole society and media vilifying and making everything that happens in the black community negative put me in danger. And made me feel less than. And as a reporter, she understood that because she was from the community, and she wasn't going to allow that misrepresentation of our community to continually affect us as a people. So she educated the folks who controlled the media through her stories and through going in the office. And once she left the station, I went and fought for many stories, and I would have never done it if I didn't learn from her how to do that. I was a photographer. Photographers didn't motivate stories. But once I realized I could and I knew how to do it, I followed her lead, and even after she was gone, I still continued that legacy. And many of us in the news business who learned from her continued that legacy to make sure we told the truth about our community. And I wouldn't be publisher and owner of the Bay State Banner if it wasn't for understanding the importance and how it affects our community. Her legacy lives on in me and many of the other journalists who are still out there.
And in our bosses, she taught the executives that there was a story here. I think she wasn't just us she was teaching. She was teaching the people who'd hired her.
And it's striking how important that her example was, not just within journalism, but to people who were affected by it. So we had the Reverend Marina White Hammond discussing Shaw's importance to her and her dedication to uplifting stories of Bostonians at the memorial yesterday.
It was really important to see someone who looked like me out there covering the news. She was also trying to shape what kinds of stories were covered and the perspective of how those stories were covered. I remember her telling me that one of her big battles was to make sure that when they lifted up Roxbury, it wasn't just always for negative things. She knew you had to cover when we lost somebody because of a shooting, but you also needed to cover when a library was open, and you also needed to cover when our young people were winning in the state championships. And she made sure that there was the kind of even coverage that painted a picture of our community that, to be honest with you, you didn't see on every station.
Marita, any last words about her?
Well, it's one thing to be a first, and she was the first, but everyone always says they want to see people behind them. And I think what we're hearing is that there's a long, long line of people standing behind her whom she brought along. She opened the door for, she mentored, and she grew.
It sounds like she's someone who left a long legacy behind her of people who grew and are stronger because of her, and we'll remember her for that. Marita Rivero, Ron Mitchell, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, a moving exhibit now on display in Boston. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, displays some 700 artifacts tell the stories of the more than 1 million people who were murdered at the Nazi concentration camp during World War II. GBH News arts reporter Haley Lerner recently toured the exhibit, and she joins now to discuss. I should note, GBH is one of the exhibition's local media partners. Haley, tell us about what it's like going through this exhibit.
It's a very moving exhibition. It's very hard to go through. It takes some time to walk through the exhibit. They expect anywhere from about an hour and a half to 2 hours to walk through this. So, be prepared when you do visit this that it is, of course, such hard subject matter, but it's an exhibit that really shows a timeline of how this concentration camp came to be, and kind of the process, from the very start of its history onto, of course, what we know happened during the Holocaust.
Okay. And so, what was the inspiration for putting this exhibit together here and now?
So this exhibit is going to be, it's eventually going to travel throughout the world, but it's a way of getting these exhibitions and these specific artifacts from Auschwitz around the country so people can see it. It's going to be around the world eventually too, and it kind of brings closer these objects that you might only see if you go to certain museums, or it brings in artifacts from all different museums throughout the world. That way that there's kind of a full story and complete picture of how this specific concentration camp came to be, and it really serves as an educational tool here in Boston.
So I think we have video of two exhibit goers talking about how they were moved by what they saw.
There was a baby shoe in there with a sock that it's hard, because I have a grandchild that has a shoe about that size, and she takes her shoes off all the time. And it's a fun thing for us because, she's taking her shoe off. But then when you see a shoe like that, it's taken off under those circumstances, it's completely different.
I think it's sad that we have a lot of generations that have no idea that this happened. What's going on in our country today scares me, because this is all based on hate. And one person made people hate other people. And look what happened.
So I think this exhibit is particularly powerful given events in the world today. How did that shape the experience of people who were there?
I think people there really felt the heavy emotions present. They came away from it very moved. Most people that I talked to were in tears, or, were very touched by what happened. And it really, to them and to many people that I spoke to, like you just heard, they really wanted this exhibition to teach people to remember what happened, to try to not repeat the history of our past, because, it is so horrible when you see it happen. And so everyone that went through that, truly, all they could say is that I can't believe that this happened, but everyone needs to remember that it did.
So was there a particular part of the exhibit that hit you the hardest?
There's one part of the exhibition where there's just a glass case full of everyday objects, whether it be, a hairpin or just regular clothes you'd have in your purse. And that to me really stuck out, because it's things that you don't really think about people forgetting. It's not necessarily, the artifacts that people would remember as hard-hitting, but it's things that you have with us every day in your purse or your bag, and to see those artifacts and know that they were taken from people and moments before their death, and they were stripped even just from the simplest little items from them, that to me really hit.
It sounds like this is an exhibit you think everyone in Boston should attend.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on a happier note, it sounds like there's a lot of things happening in Coolidge Corner you wanted to tell us about.
Yes, there are. The Coolidge Corner Theater just opened up. I believe tomorrow it's officially going to be open for its expansion. It has 2 new theaters, a whole new education center, and it's a really big expansion of this very iconic theater.
And so what's going to be what's going to be performing there to start off with?
There are going to be a lot of kind of legacy movies. I believe they're going to be showing The Wizard of Oz. And so there are these 2 theaters. They call them the Blue Room and the Red Room, kind of on their own. They're technically theater 5 and 6, but there's these really bright red lights in one and really, electric blue ones. And it's a really great space too. There's going to be even more different movies showing, and there's an opportunity for more indie films to be shown and to have more premieres, and so they're really excited about the opportunity to expand the showings they have at the Coolidge.
So what's the thought about how this is going to affect the sort of the community around it?
Yeah, so when I've talked to, the people that work there, they're really excited to put on more community events. They're going to have more workshops and learning opportunities because they now actually have the space for that. And there's also an expanded lobby area, so there's just really more of a gathering space at the theater. So it's not just, oh, you have to leave after your movie because there's only so much space. Now there's really an opportunity for people to gather and to talk about films, and a lot more opportunity for events, which they already have there.
So what's the first thing you're going to see there?
Oh, I don't know. I really have to look at their schedule. I encourage everyone to look at the lineup and see, what you're looking forward to. But I got to watch a little short, movie show clip at the theater. The screens look incredible. The sound sounds great. So I'm very excited for everyone there to see what they can.
So have you been there before?
Yeah, of course.
What's the change?
The change is that instead of just having a few theaters, they've now expanded to, it's completely different the entire footprint. There's a whole new entrance, and so when you see the outside of the building, there's a completely new facade, and it's really incredible to see how much they've grown and the amount of investment. I mean, it's grown 14,000 square feet, so it's a really big growth.
So I think Coolidge Corner is a special place to a lot of people in Boston. I know I have a lot of memories there. What do you remember about Coolidge Corner?
I just remember, I've been going there since college, since I was around here, and so I just remember those theaters really, they don't feel like a normal chain movie theater. It feels special because it is a nonprofit, and they really are committed to movie going and caring about that. And so being in that, there's that one, the movie theater one that they have there, this big room with these beautiful ceilings and very Art Deco feel, and I think there's a real impact in seeing a movie in the way that you kind of traditionally would expect to see it.
And I mean, this makes these theaters can make a difference, right? So Casablanca, I think, was kept alive by a movie theater in Harvard Square for a generation before people rediscovered it and figured out how great it really was. Mm-hmm. And so with Coolidge Corner Theater, are they hoping to do something similar?
Yeah, they're keeping movie going alive. They really hope to put on more programming for studying film and, bringing in students and bringing in, classes and really having the opportunity to talk about film and develop it and keep the movie-going business alive in Massachusetts, which is a very big business here. There's a lot of movies that film here, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for the Coolidge to partner with them and really put on premieres and make the audience here in Boston even bigger as moviegoers.
I remember when I was in college, the only way to see a first-run movie was to go out to Fresh Pond. So it's nice to see Boston changing in a way that we can all enjoy, and I think why don't we all go out and see a movie sometime soon. Haley Lerner, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, is running now through September 2nd at the Castle at Park Plaza. For tickets and more information, go to the AuschwitzExhibition.com. That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching. I'm Gautam Mukunda, and good night.
It has wonderful